You check the weather app before you leave the house. You complain when it rains on your one day off. You have never once, in your entire life, had to wonder if the sky itself might try to kill you. But 74,000 years ago, it did. And the people who lived through it were not so different from you. This is the story of the worst single day in human history. Not a war, not a plague, a mountain. On the island of Sumatra, a volcano called Toba erupted with a force so massive that scientists still argue about how anyone survived it at all. It was not an eruption like the ones you picture. Lava did not simply flow down a hillside. The explosion was thousands of times larger than Mount St. Helens. It carved out a hole in the earth so big it eventually filled with water and became a lake the size of a small country. You could stand at one shore of Lake Toba today and not see the other side. Ash did not just fall near the volcano. It circled the globe. In parts of India, geologists have found ash layers over 5 meters thick, laid down in a matter of days. Sunlight dimmed. Temperatures dropped. Some researchers estimated the eruption could have triggered a volcanic winter lasting years, maybe longer. Picture the actual mechanics of it for a second. An eruption that size doesn't just bury the nearest village. It punches ash and sulfur high enough into the atmosphere that winds carry it around the entire planet within weeks. Sunlight scatters off that haze instead of reaching the ground. Crops fail, not in one region, but potentially across continents at once. Rivers that animals depend on freeze earlier and thaw later. None of this happens gradually enough for anyone to adjust on their own schedule. It happens all at once, everywhere, to everyone. For a long time, scientists believed this single event nearly wiped humanity off the map. Here is where the story gets stranger. Because the deeper researchers dig, the less it looks like extinction, and the more it looks like something else. Something almost impossible to imagine, standing in your kitchen with the thermostat set exactly where you like it. It looks like adaptation. In the 1990s, geologist Stanley Ambrose proposed what became known as the Toba catastrophe theory. He pointed to genetic studies showing surprisingly low diversity among modern humans compared to other primates, and argued the eruption caused a genetic bottleneck in early humans, a population crash so severe that every person alive today might descend from a tiny surviving group, maybe only a few thousand people, huddled together while the world went dark and cold around them. For years, this idea shaped how anthropologists understood human history. A near miss, a species that almost didn't make it. Some versions of the theory put the surviving population as low as a few thousand breeding pairs scattered across the planet. Sit with that number for a second. A few thousand people. That is smaller than most towns you've driven through without noticing. And if the theory holds, every person you have ever met, every name in your contacts, every stranger on your commute traces back to that fragile handful. But not every scientist agreed. And that disagreement led to one of the more remarkable discoveries in human evolution. Archaeologist Michael Petraglia led excavations at sites in southern India, digging directly through the ash layer Toba left behind. If the catastrophe theory was right, tools should stop appearing right at that layer. Human presence should vanish, or at least go quiet for generations, while a shattered population slowly clawed its way back. Instead, his team found stone tools above and below the ash, made in strikingly similar styles, using the same core techniques as before the eruption. The people making them did not disappear. They kept knapping flint. They kept living. Whatever happened to the climate, whoever these humans were, they endured it, and they kept doing what humans do best. They adapted. That single detail, a layer of continuous tool-making running straight through a layer of volcanic ash, quietly undid decades of assumption. It suggested the story was never really about a species barely scraping by. It was about a species that had already figured out how to bend without breaking, long before anyone thought to test it against a mountain. So how? How does anyone survive years of ash, cold, and darkness with nothing but stone tools and each other? Part of the answer may lie on the southern coast of Africa, far from Sumatra, at a place called Pinnacle Point. Archaeologist Curtis Marean has spent decades studying caves along this coastline, and what he found reshapes the whole picture. Around the time of the Toba eruption, some human groups were not living off unpredictable land animals that vanish the moment the climate shifts. They were harvesting shellfish, mussels, clams, a food source that does not migrate, does not need sunlight to grow overnight, and sits right there on the rocks whenever the tide goes out. Marean's research suggests coastal populations had a buffer other groups didn't. When ash choked the sky and plants struggled and animals scattered, the ocean kept giving. Slowly, reliably. Enough to get through a bad decade instead of dying in the first bad year. His excavations also turned up something else worth pausing on. Pigments, likely used for symbolic marking. Early evidence of heat-treating stone to make sharper tools. Signs of people not just scraping by, but experimenting, refining, passing techniques to each other. Survival, it turns out, rarely looks like grim endurance alone. It looks like curiosity that refuses to switch off, even when the sky itself has gone strange. This is not a story about strength winning out. It is a story about flexibility winning out. The humans who survived were not necessarily the toughest or the smartest in some abstract sense. They were the ones willing to eat something new, live somewhere unfamiliar, trust a food source their ancestors hadn't relied on before. Think about what that actually required. Someone at some point had to be the first person in their group to pry a mussel off a rock and eat it. No guarantee it was safe. No guidebook. Just hunger and a willingness to try. You inherited that willingness. It is sitting in you right now, whether the world around you looks like it or not. Here is the counterintuitive twist researchers keep circling back to. Catastrophe may not be the enemy of a species. Comfort might be. The groups who had built their entire lives around one dependable food source, one dependable place, were the ones most exposed when the sky changed. The groups who had already learned to be a little uncomfortable, a little improvisational, already eating strange new things and testing unfamiliar coastlines, were the ones who had practice for exactly this moment. You were built by the ones who tried the mussel, not the ones who waited for things to go back to normal. There is a modern mirror here, and it is not subtle. You live in a world engineered for comfort. Climate control. Grocery stores stocked no matter the season. Food delivered to your door in under 30 minutes. And still, something in you resists change. A new job. A new city. A new way of doing something you've always done, one way. Your instinct, most days, is to stick with what worked yesterday. But the biology underneath that instinct was shaped by ancestors who did the opposite, who faced literal ash falling from the sky and decided the answer was to try something new, not retreat further into the familiar. Every time you're staring down a change you didn't ask for, a layoff, a move, a diagnosis, a diet forced on you by circumstance, you're running the same basic software your ancestors ran on that coastline 74,000 years ago. Test something unfamiliar. See if it keeps you alive. Adjust. Notice the shape of your own resistance the next time something forces your hand. It rarely announces itself as fear. It shows up disguised as reasonableness. Why fix something that isn't broken? Why learn a new system when the old one still technically works? Why leave a job, a relationship, a routine that is merely tolerable for something unproven? That voice feels like wisdom. Most of the time, it is just comfort, wearing wisdom's clothes. Your ancestors on that coastline did not have the luxury of that voice winning very often. The ones who listened to it, who stayed loyal to whatever food source or shelter had worked before without adjusting, are not your ancestors. They are a dead end in someone else's family tree. You exist because, somewhere in that chain, enough people overruled the voice that says, "Stay put," often enough to get you here. Psychologists studying resilience today keep landing on a similar idea, even without referencing Toba directly. The people who cope best with sudden disruption are rarely the ones who resist change hardest. They're the ones who treat uncertainty as a problem to be solved rather than a wall to push against. That is not a personality trait you either have or don't. It is a pattern, practiced generation after generation, long before anyone called it resilience. There's another detail from the Toba story worth sitting with. The eruption didn't just test survival, it tested connection. Small, scattered human groups likely couldn't have made it through years of disrupted climate entirely alone. Shared knowledge about which coastlines still had shellfish, which valleys still held water, which routes were survivable, had to move between groups somehow. Isolation was a death sentence. Community was a technology, every bit as important as a sharpened stone tool. You feel an echo of that too, even now. Notice how much worse hard news lands when you're alone with it, and how much more bearable it feels the second you say it out loud to someone else. That is not softness. That is 74,000 years of your ancestors learning that the people who share what they know outlast the people who hoard it. Think about the last time you solved a real problem entirely by yourself, with no advice, no search engine, no conversation with anyone who had faced it before. It's rare, isn't it? Even now, surrounded by more independence and more convenience than any humans in history, your first instinct under real pressure is still to reach for another person. Not because you're weak, because reaching for another person is, quite literally, the strategy that built you. So the mountain that should have ended everything ended up teaching the opposite lesson. Not toughness for its own sake. Flexibility. Willingness to eat the unfamiliar thing. Walk the unfamiliar coastline. Trust the person next to you with what little you know. Toba didn't just survive as an event humans lived through. In a strange way, it wrote the instructions your body still follows every time the ground shifts under you. You check the weather app before you leave the house. You complain when it rains on your one day off. But somewhere underneath that mild inconvenience is the same nervous system that once watched ash fall from the sky and decided quietly to keep going anyway.